happens if we are going to disagree, though? That's the hard question. So, if the Constitution is both a historic document and a living document, and it's invoked by different people for different ends, what do? How do we disagree? How do we solve our disagreements peacefully? Because in American history, we've mostly solved them peacefully. And if you look at the constellation of new democracies that are blooming in the Middle East, are they starting peacefully? No. So we can be a little smug. We've had one major bloodshed event, the Civil War, to solve constitutional questions. But for the most part, other than violent periods in the civil rights movement and in the anti-war movement of the 1960s and early 1970s, we largely have peaceful resolution of conflict over the Constitution. How do we pull that off?
It's set up in the Constitution to be able to solve the issues.
Okay, good. So how? So this is C. So what are some ways that we express disagreement and, dare I say, solve, meaning not answering a question, but moving forward as a country? So, or there are other verbs here. So how do you get the first crack at that?
You do like legislation.
Okay, good. So here, there's a connection. Do lawmakers interpret the Constitution? Yes, they do. Now, as part of the Tea Party movement, the incoming Republican majority in 2010 said that they were going to create a rule in the House that every piece of legislation has to invoke the exact clause of the Constitution that they are using. What was the implication of that promise? That wasn't done before, so
We're going to follow the Constitution.
right, we're going to follow the Constitution, but that's not really true, that it was not done before. It may not have been done like that, but there's certainly, in every piece of law, some connection to what lawmakers perceive as their constitutional duty, not just by reading the Constitution, but by taking an oath of office that is remarkably similar to the President's oath of office, which gives them some leeway to constitutional interpretation. So, in other words, we have connections here, indirect some of them, between voters, candidates, and law. Is this politics? And then what happens if the Constitution is incorrectly observed here, or incorrectly interpreted? Then what do? Right, we challenge it. Where do we challenge? In the courts. Good. Now, one of the most important pet peeves that I have, though, about teaching American government to my students, but this is certainly true of adults too, is that sometimes we've been brainwashed about the power of the court. And we'll get to that when we start looking at the Constitution. Is the court the final stop in the Constitution conflict train?
No.
Or route? No, it isn't. Has the court ever been overruled? Yes. Can it be overruled? Yes. So let's think of at least 4 ways. At least. We're still on C. So 4 ways the Supreme Court can be, I'm putting quotation marks because it's not technically overruled, it's just simply not, the last decision is not going to stand. At least. There are definitely more, but let's just get these down. There are temporary and permanent ways, and there are other ways in between. Bob, any order is fine?
Amendment to the Constitution.
Okay, good. That's the most permanent way. An amendment to the Constitution. Good. Has this happened before, where an amendment to the Constitution overrules a court decision? Yes. Can you think of just, there are only a few. Can you think
Plessy versus Ferguson.
I wouldn't put Plessy versus Ferguson there. But you're right that there's another very, very infamous case on civil rights. Not Plessy. Well, let me show. Okay, no. Okay, so the U.S. Supreme Court itself can change its ruling. Okay, so this is what I would say here, that Plessy in 1896 and Brown in 1954 asked the same question, which is, can a state by majority, meaning the lawmakers, through clean and fair elections, through clean and fair legislative procedures, even if there were full voting rights, do majorities have the right in a state? So again, assuming there's full participation in a state, assuming that the election was clean, assuming that the legislative processes are clean, can a state, by majority rule, decide to segregate public facilities by race? Same question. So Plessy was largely about public transportation, Brown was largely about public schools, but it's the same question. Can a state openly sponsor segregated public accommodations? Because that's what the majority of the state has decided through normal law. What was the answer to Plessy?
Yes.
Yes, and the answer to Brown?
No.
No. So what explains this? Did the Constitution's text change?
Interpretation change.
Right. So this is interesting.
So was it an act that overruled it?
No,
Did
that's what's so strange.
So
The
what-
Constitution's text did not change. You can safely assume all the justices here are dead. So how does the Supreme Court overrule itself? What does it say? Did we just get the Constitution wrong?
No.
Yes. Actually, that is exactly what they say. But when enough time passes, the assumption is that a blind adherence to precedent is not the ticket to legitimacy of an institution, and that actually it can make your court irrelevant. So the court itself simply changed their interpretation. This does not happen as often as it might seem, but we will talk about some cases during the New Deal switch where 50 years did not go by, and actually just a couple of years went by, and the court abruptly changed course. So the amendment to the Constitution that I was referring to, for example, the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment, what do these amendments do?
Abolish slavery.
Right, so we've abolished slavery, and in the 14th Amendment, the first sentence of the 14th Amendment,
Do you give rights to former slaves?
yes, and most important right is
Right.
citizenship.
Citizenship.
But voting comes in the 15th, so, and that's only for black men, and that was not actually put into place for 100 years. We can get to that a little bit later. But the point here, the case I was referring to was the Dred Scott case. So it's a very complicated case. Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. And Dred Scott was a slave suing for his freedom against his master who had essentially inherited him from another family. And Scott argued that because he had lived and traveled in different states, some of which were free states and free territories, including Illinois and the territory of Wisconsin, that he was free. He sued in federal court, and the United States Supreme Court said that he's not a federal citizen and he has no right to sue. And his case was thrown out. But then the court went further than that and declared unconstitutional the Missouri Compromise that gave us the free territory of the North and said essentially that property rights are property rights anywhere in the United States, and Congress cannot take that away. Congress, in other words, could not create a free state. It's a pretty famous decision. In fact, it is the second time after Marbury that the court declared an act of constitution wrong, and that was 1803. So the court was pretty restrained about congressional action. The point, though, is that Scott was determined not to be a citizen even though he was born in the United States. After the Civil War, these two amendments not only abolished slavery, but gave every person born here the right of citizenship, both of the state and of the country. Now, the amendment does not directly say we are overruling Dred Scott, but it was considered to be widely accepted. Okay, let's go back down here. So what about the law? Can the law overrule, regular law? Can the law of a state overrule the Supreme Court? Can the law of Congress simply overrule it, just by saying we've overruled it?
You make a new law.
Yes, and then which is in effect? The court's decision or the new law? So let's say a state decided, I'm sorry, this looks terrible. You know that in 1832 and 1833 there was a nullification crisis that was pre-shadowed the Civil War, where South Carolina said, we are not going to enforce federal law. And we have the right to do that. So what would happen today if a state said, we are not going to enforce any provisions of the healthcare law because we think it's unconstitutional? Or we're going to pass a law that specifically challenges it, or if Congress specifically challenges it. Are these new constitutional interpretations that take precedence? until, what?
Someone sues in court.
Right, until somebody else sues in court, but in the meantime, so this is a legislative action, who else gets involved with constitutional interpretation under C? In other words, my point is that the court, we know for a fact that the court does not settle anything in this country, even though we are told it's the final stop. If it were true, we wouldn't have so much constitutional conflict after a court decision. So envision in your mind, if you can, after Brown, what happened in Little Rock in 1957? What happened in Oxford, Mississippi in 1962? If Brown settled this question, why are presidents sending troops to integrate students? So enforcement of the law is a way of overruling. And, or not. Because remember, if you know that area of history, you know Eisenhower and Kennedy were not pleased to be in this situation at all. Eisenhower for more perhaps philosophical reasons that he didn't really agree with the Brown decision. Kennedy for political reasons because he's a Democrat. The South was still majority Democrat, at least the white South was definitely majority Democrat. So then you have the states. Are states allowed to fight back? Yes. So what does all this mean then? Under C. We can wear ourselves out right here, by the way. And I feel a little bit. But then what do we do with the text? Let's get back to that. We're going to look at the text. What do we do? How are we alive for all this time? We're the longest living constitutional democracy in the world.
Because it has the ability to adapt and change.
Yes. And how do we do that, though? It's not pretty. I'm sorry, tell me your name.
Jay.
Jay. We call it politics. Okay, the word that you love to hate. You don't like office politics, you don't like family politics, you don't like real politics. And yet, what is politics? It is the peaceful resolution of conflict with the assumption that there are processes, there are legislative methods, there are electoral methods of solving some of these questions. And I don't mean solving forever, but for the moment. This is the hardest part. This is how you know we've made it as a country. What do you do when you're not in the correct view of C, though? As a society, what happens to you if you choose the loser this November? Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever voted for somebody who lost? What do you do with your bumper sticker? What do you do if you're Some people keep on that bumper sticker. And after a certain period of time goes by, they feel like they're showing off that they made the correct decision. And sometimes people pull in their yard sign right away, and sometimes they don't, and you stew a little bit. But what do? That's the trick. The trick is not that we decide by majority and we're all actually trying to go toward unanimity. That is absolutely unrealistic. The true test of a vibrant democracy is what do the losers do? What happens? Now, I was talking with somebody in the hall before I came in who said her daughter's threatening to move to Canada. After the election, people always threaten to move to Canada. People don't know who the Canadian Prime Minister is, so I don't think that's very realistic. Canadian politics does not hold our imagination as much as we might think it is. People really don't want to move to Canada, although it's lovely. You know, I'm sure you've been there, but the truth is, how do we move on?
Looking for the next decade.
Because what do we assume is true about this bizarre mess, this principled mess of resolving our differences? That eventually you will have another opportunity to make your case that your view of the Constitution is better. Not necessarily more correct, because as we'll see, the Constitution is maddeningly vague about certain things. But when you take a combination of the old and the new, what we get is this strange cycle of conflict that we are much better at than we might think we are.